moving on to the last question of our video, students. This particular question is pertaining to your world history. Let's understand what the question is trying to say. So basically it starts with a statement which we ultimately need to evaluate. Now the statement says, students, that there was a serious challenge in the democratic state system between the two world wars, and we need to evaluate this statement. So the directive given to us here is evaluate. Now again, evaluate, students, just like enumerate or elucidate wants us to create a descriptive analysis in which we will highlight the pros and cons with respect to the democratic state system. So the directive, students, I hope you have been able to understand that whenever we have terms like evaluate, enumerate, elucidate, you always start with a descriptive analysis, and the trick part, students, is the conclusion, wherein the conclusion you highlight the positives, the negatives, and ultimately arrive at a neutral conclusion. Now herein, students, the statement is talking about a particular time period, that is the time between the two world wars. So if you don't know, you should know that the first world war was between 1914 to 1918, and the second world war started in the year 1939. So basically the time period that we are dealing with is 1918 to 1939. That is the period between the two world wars. Now this period between the two world wars, students, witnessed major events with respect to the global politics, wherein time and again the democratic system was both challenged and reinstated. Hence, students, as a part of evaluating this particular statement, in the body, we will give two types of points, wherein the first point will be highlighting how the democratic system was shattered between 1918 to 1939, and at the same time, how in the other parts of the world, this particular state system was being supported, and both of them will be done with the by the means of giving examples and statements. So as a part of this question, students, we start with the introduction, wherein first of all in the introduction we are going to define that how the time period between the two world wars, that is between 1918 to 1939, was a time period of great chaos at the international stage. That is, on the world level, there was a threat that can be seen towards the democratic state system. Herein, students, on the international front, there were many events that had happened that could throw away the idea of democracy altogether. However, we see that eventually after the Second World War, the world again started to incorporate the democratic ideals in their state systems. Now herein, students, first of all, I would like to tell you, I hope you are all aware that in the world history, when we specifically talk about the time period between the world wars, very radical ideologies towards the extreme left, that is communism, and radical ideologies towards the extreme right, such as fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, had come up. And both of these, students, were kind of serious threats towards the democratic state system, and hence we conclude that the period was a time period of great upheaval and a challenge towards democratic state system. But at the same time, students, you will see that these decades, that is the 1920s and the 1930s on the global level, were also kind of a time period in which the democratic system was adopted. Many people were becoming anti-imperial, anti-colonialism. People were asking, women were asking for suffrage rights. If we talk about India, as a part of the administrative reforms, greater autonomy was being demanded by the Indians. All of these leading towards strengthening the core ideals of democratic system. Hence, we can see that it was like a balancing scale dwindling towards either sides depending on the world political events. And thus, when we proceed towards our body, we talk about both the challenges and the acceptance that was given to the democratic system between the two world wars. Keeping this in mind, students, let's proceed towards our body, wherein first of all, we are going to highlight the major challenges that were posed to the democratic state system between the time period of 1918 to 1939. Now, students, I had told you that this time period in the global politics reflected into the coming of some radical far right and far left ideologies. When we talk about the far right ideology, students, it kind of coincides with the rise of fascism and Nazism in Italy and Germany, respectively. These people were far right people who were opposed to democracy. Herein, one person, that is either the president of the country, such as Hitler or Mussolini, were leading the entire country. It was kind of going towards a monarchical structure wherein these people were tyrant and their word was considered the final word, which is absolutely against the ideals of a democratic state system. In fact, students, despite the fact that a single person was leading the country, both of these people had a lot of popular appeal in their respective countries, thus threatening the democratic state system even further. Apart from the far right ideology, students, we see that a great push was given to the far left ideology, that is communism, as well to a great extent. Let's take an example of India itself. Now, in the 1920s, we see that there was growth of communism in the Indian political system. Many young nationalists were greatly influenced by the Russian Revolution. They wanted to overthrow the British government and create a political system that was based on communism ideology. And that is why we can see that not only on the global level when it comes to Russia, China, but even in India, there was a lot of support that was garnered by the far left communist ideology. And both of these students, both far right and far left ideologies, were not they were against the democratic state system, and thus they were posing a challenge to this particular state system philosophy. Moving on, students, apart from that, we see that many totalitarian leaders were coming up who were again challenging the ideals of a democratic state system, which ultimately translates to representation of all. If every citizen of the country is heard, this means that there is democracy. But if there is a totalitarian leader such as Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin in USSR, or Francisco Franco in Spain, these people were totalitarian leaders. Their word was the final word. The representation of citizens was almost zero in their countries, and at this point of time, this becomes a big threat to the democratic state system, especially towards the fact that these people were popular in their countries and were widely accepted. Apart from the dictator point, students, we see that a lot of civil wars were happening between 1918 to 1939. The most famous one was the Spanish Civil War. Now, these people were disillusioned by their political leaders and leading towards civil wars, which is something that could not be seen as a part of a democratic state system, hence again posing a challenge to the idea of democracy. At the same time, students, another strand of ideology that can be seen during the decades of 20s and 30s was radical armed movements, which is also defined as the revolutionary phase when it comes to the Indian scenario. Now, we see, students, in the 1920s, revolutionaries came in the Indian political system. People such as Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad believed that in order to achieve political gains, we need to use violence. We need to overthrow the entire government. We don't need a government in the first place. Now, not needing the government in the first place is a term that translates to anarchy. Anarchy means, students, no presence of government whatsoever. No presence of any kind of government. So, apart from the far right and far left, we have these radical revolutionaries who were using violence and did not believe in the concept of government at all. And these people were also garnering attention in different parts of the world. We have HSRA in India. Also, in countries such as Ireland, you will see that many leaders were driven or inspired by the concept of anarchy, which is again a threat to the democratic state system. Apart from the students, we see that there was outbreak of many smaller wars on the global front in this time period, wherein we can see the Sino-Soviet conflict or the Japanese aggression on neighboring states. And we see the Hitler's conquest of Czechoslovakia, which is absolutely against the concept of democracy, wherein in democracy, the citizens of the country are able to determine their own future. They neither encroach on other person's territory nor let anybody encroach their own territory. But all these ideals were broken away during the 20s and 30s, and we see the aggression of a major power towards its neighboring states, such as the Sino-Soviet conflict, again leading or posing as a threat to the democratic state system. Despite these challenges, students, there were on the global level many supporting events as well towards the concept of democratic state, and many countries wanted to adopt democracy in its wholehearted manner. Here in students, some examples include the dismantling of monarchies. For instance, the Ottoman Empire was demolished. It was a monarchy, it was a long monarchy that had been a part of the medieval history and even of the modern history, but this was completely destroyed during the decades of 1920s. Also, students, the Hungarian Empire was dismantled, and all of these ultimately became democracies. We see the rise of global level organizations such as the coming of League of Nations, which kind of highlighted or put a lot of emphasis on the need for democracy and self-determination, which is an eminent part of democracy at the international stage, and kind of urged all the nations to adopt democracy for a more peaceful global environment. At the same time, students, we see that there are many voices that were raising against the concept of colonialism and imperialism. There were third world countries, including, of course, India, who strongly demanded the right to self-determination and democracy for their country. And this again came out as a support towards democracy. So we can see, students, when we keep on analyzing the global events between 1918 to 1939, there are both kind of events, one that can shatter the ideals of democracy, whereas many events which are upholding the tenets of a democratic state. Apart from the students, we see that the idea of self-governance was garnering a lot of attention in dominions such as Canada and many European powers who wanted to determine their own future, wanted to take power in their own hands, and wanted to be a part of decision-making process of their own country. Apart from the students, we see that a lot of democratic reforms were happening on the global front. If we specifically talk about India, we see that the political leaders were time and again demanding for greater representation of Indians in their country, and this was even given to them as a part of the Chelmsford reforms, and later on with the Government of India Act 1935, more and more participation was being desired by the Indians, which ultimately led to their freedom. And then the model that we adopted for our country was pure democracy. Finally, students, another support that was given to the democratic state was the greater acceptance by many sections of the society of the world with respect to suffrage or representation. By suffrage, students, we mean the right to vote. Now we know that the right to vote was something that was earlier restricted to the male members or the members who had certain degree of money. But once the democratic ideals became more and more strong on the global front, the right to suffrage was demanded by larger sections of the society. Women in India, Britain, Canada wanted the suffrage rights. Poor people wanted the suffrage rights. They wanted that there should be no barrier with respect to caste, community, or economy that kind of stops them in voting for their own future. So, students, all these ideas were kind of supporting the idea of democratic state system. So, again, students, we see that there is this swing on the swing which sometimes swings towards the challenges of this democratic state system, and sometimes it swings back towards the events which kind of give more power to the democratic state system. Hence, if we critically evaluate this particular statement, we can arrive at a conclusion that the interwar years were a decisive period which both questioned the democracy in many ways, but at the same time laid the groundwork for later development of democracy after the Second World War. We know, students, that after the Second World War, many third world countries were successfully able to get their independence from the colonial powers, and most of these countries adopted the democratic state system to govern themselves. So ultimately, after the Second World War, we can see that democracy won, but it was during the interwar period that the idea of democracy was challenged due to the far left, far right, and the radical revolutionary ideologies. But ultimately, after the Second World War, we see that democracy triumphed over any other state political system. So with this, students, the final question has also been analyzed. I hope you have understood all the questions thoroughly. Again, I would like to repeat, students, that whenever we attempt any mains question, we look towards the directive to understand what do we need to put as a part of our introduction and conclusion. We take out the major keywords, such as in this question we have the democratic state system or defining the period between two world wars, and on the basis of that we divide our body. So the directive is meant for your introduction and conclusion, and the keywords define that what will you incorporate as a part of your body. So with this, your answers and discussion is complete. Thank you so much.
Amrita IAS Academy.